Hey, Kingdom Women. Welcome back to another episode of the Girl Speak Life podcast. We are continuing in our Healing Woman series, and today we are going to talk about separation versus isolation. Listen, I'm going to jump right in because I have been hearing all around. I don't know what's going on in the Christian community, okay? But I have been hearing all around people saying, all of these messages of people saying, oh, God isolates us. God has put us in a season of isolation. What? Let me get closer to this microphone and let me draw you in closer. Come closer, sis. Come closer. God does not isolate us. Hear me clearly. Declare that. God does not isolate me. God did not isolate me. He did not isolate you, sis. And he never will. God separates us. That's all that he does. He will never isolate you. So if you have heard a message being preached by somebody, one of your favorite people in the world, or your pastor, somebody, sorry to comfort them, sorry to you, sis, sorry to you, bro, sorry to say this, but God does not isolate us. I'm sorry. Not sorry. But God does not isolate us. He does not. There is a very distinct difference between isolation and separation. And we have to know and discern that difference. We have just come out of a season where the enemy tried to isolate us, tried to keep us in a state of isolation. And for many people, we are still obviously stuck in that season of isolation. Or he's still trying to keep us bound in that season of isolation. It's time to come out, sis. It's time for you to recognize. It's time for you to recognize it for what it is. God does not isolate us. He separates us. So let's talk about it. Let's recognize it. Let's put our finger on it. Let's discern it. Okay? Let's talk about first the definitions of it. Let's talk about isolation first. Isolation is the state of being alone. It is the state of being alone, cut off from meaningful connections and support. Did y'all catch that? We talking about COVID-19, remember? Remember when you got sick? And you had to go into a different room and you couldn't be with your family. You couldn't be with your friends. You had to be cut off from those connections, from that support. And you had to be all by yourself in order to become well, quote unquote, well. Separation, however, is being set apart. It's a deliberate distancing from influences, from other influences. One is a state of being alone or cutting off from meaningful connections and support. Another is being set apart or a deliberate distancing. Oh God, I cannot say this word, from other influences. So now that we got those definitions out the way, let's see how, let's look at some examples in the Bible, right? Let's look at Abraham. God told Abraham to leave. He called him out from his homeland. He called him to separate from his homeland, but he was still surrounded by a supportive community of people. Lot was still with him. His family was still with him. He wasn't isolated. Even though God told him to move from one place to another, he was still surrounded by people. Even though God told him to move from these other influences into a new place, he was still surrounded by his family. And then let's look at Jesus, right? Jesus spent all his time in prayer. He often separated himself from his disciples. And he will often go and connect with the Father in deep prayer, right? But he also had that community with him, right? He would separate himself from those influences, from those people, from his disciples. But he would always go and connect with the Father, right? So that was a separation. And then you have people in isolation. And this is the big one. And I'm going to focus on Elijah today. Then you have people like Elijah, right? You have people like Elijah. And you can find Elijah's story in 1 Kings 19. You have people like Elijah who, when he had finished killing all of their prophets or whatever, and Jezebel was like, "Oh, I'm gonna kill you. I'm coming after you," or whatever. And Elijah got scared, so he ran. He ran with his servant, but once he ran, he left his servant behind, and he left by himself to the wilderness, into the desert or whatever. And he asked the Lord to die. He wanted to die, basically. So he isolated himself. He took it upon himself to be in a lone place. He cut himself off from his connections and from his support. And then if you read down further, after, all of that, the Lord sent him some food, blah, 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 said get up, or whatever. If you read down further, he then goes on to leave again. He goes on He goes on a walk for 40 days and nights. And then he goes into a cave. And what does the Lord do? He asks him, "Why are you here? What are you even doing here? Elijah, why are you here, Elijah?" And Elijah's just like, "Well, there's nobody else here. There's no other prophets. They killed everybody." And the Lord's like, "Okay, but why are you here?" Elijah isolated himself. And that's exactly what isolation is all about. Someone who I admire so much, I'm going to shout her out, Prophetess Tamika. We were talking about isolation and separation. I don't know when or what we were talking about at our church and Bible study one time. But we were talking about this, I think it was like last year sometime. And she said something so great. She said, isolation means that we have assigned loneliness to ourselves. We have assigned loneliness to ourselves. That right there is crazy. We assigned it to ourselves. That means God didn't give it to us. We gave it to ourselves. We put ourselves in that position. Y'all. So when somebody says God put me in a season of isolation, You're saying that God assigned you to loneliness. I don't think that that's a good thing. Why would God assign you to be lonely? Why would God want you to be lonely? When God has given us community, He's given us a body, He's given us church. Like, why would God want you to be lonely? Why? I think if God wanted man to be lonely, He would have just left it at Adam. He would have just left it at Adam. He wouldn't have even thought about Eve. He would not have even created Eve at all for man. He wouldn't have looked at Adam and said, it is not good for man to be alone. If that was the case, He would have let Adam live an isolated life. If that was the case, I think God's purpose in separation is to cultivate a deeper relationship with Him. That is His purpose in separation. Is to cultivate deeper relationship with Him. I mean, you see it with Jesus, right? Every time He separated from His disciples, He would go to be with the Father. He would go inside prayer, go to pray, right? And He was pulling on that oil, man. I think separation just brings us into the presence of God, into a deeper into the presence of God. It deepens our relationship with Him. It builds our trust in Him. Even going back to Abraham, when God moved him from one place to another, he had to be obedient to God, leaving what was known to him into the unknown, separating himself from what was familiar into something that was unfamiliar to him. It deepened his faith, deepened his relationship with the Father. Think about Moses too, right? He would take his time going up into the mountains to be with the Father for long periods of time. Man, that man was with the Lord, okay? He was with the Lord. But yeah, deepened his relationship, deepened his time with the Lord. And it cultivated the presence of God. It cultivated faith. It cultivated trust. It cultivated hope. It cultivated restoration. It cultivated healing. It cultivated deliverance. It cultivated all of these things. All of these good things. Good fruit came out of separation versus isolation. Now, there's some misconceptions that can come from being separated, because we can feel like when we're separated, when God separates us, sometimes it can feel lonely. I don't know about y'all, but in those seasons, it can definitely feel lonely. Think about David, right? When God separated him, sometimes you can feel like God abandoned you, or God is rejecting you, or not even just God is rejecting you, but even people are rejecting you, or that God is causing people around you to reject you, right? But that's not the case at all. actually God's protections, God protecting us from distractions, God protecting us from the influences of the world so that we are able to grow with Him, hear Him clearly, see what He sees clearly, be strengthened in the things of God, strengthened in our faith, strengthened in our gifts, right? David was strengthened as a warrior and a king. When he was separated, he was out there building his audience. He was building his kingdom. The people were like, they were getting to know who he was, his name. They knew who David was. And so when he finally rose up to be king, it was a no-brainer. It was like, okay, like we know this man, we trust this man. God knew exactly what he was doing while David was on the run. While David was being separated. Well, I'm not going to put the quotes because he was. But yeah, God knew exactly what he's doing in that season. He knew exactly what he's doing. And God knows exactly what he's doing in your season. You can't rush the season of separation. Don't confuse the seasons, though. God separates us. He does not isolate us. We isolate ourselves. We put ourselves in lonely seasons. And those lonely seasons bring about misery, right? Come on. They bring about misery. They tear us down, right? They don't build us up. All we do is stay in our minds. We overthink things in those seasons. Come on. Am I describing your season? That's all you hear is yourself, your emotions. That's all you hear. You don't want to hear nobody else. That's all you hear is your emotions. You're easily influenced by everybody else, easily influenced by the world, by your friends. If you even allow people in your space, right? Isolation does not bring healing, but separation does. God's separation does. And that's how you know the difference between the two. Allow God to separate you and allow God to bring his healing. Allow God to bring his healing into your life. Because God's seasons of separation bring about growth. They bring about refinement. They bring about preparation. Right? We are in a season of elevation. We are in a season of growing. It's time to come out of this lonely season. While God may separate us from this world, he does not isolate us from his love. He does not isolate us from community. So embrace the separation. Embrace the separation as a way to deeper intimacy with him. And seek out connections, the connections that he provides. Okay? All right, y'all. I love y'all. Join us or join me next week as we continue to explore this Healing Woman series on this Girl Speak Life podcast. Until then, y'all, I hope that you walk in the assurance of the presence and purpose of God. I love y'all. Make sure you like, subscribe, and share this episode with somebody that you love. In Jesus' name. All right, y'all. Bye.